The following presentation is brought to you by WLSN Radio and the 5 Pillar Podcast. Welcome back to another episode of the 5 Pillar Podcast. My name is Mike Freland. Coming up on tonight's episode, we're going to be talking to Father Alex McCullough, a Cincinnati native. We're going to find out what were his inspirations to become a priest, what his relationship was with his father, what was life like when he was in seminary, and what it's like in his day-to-day life. All of that and so much more. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. My conversation with Father Alex McCullough. How are you doing tonight?
I am doing excellent. It is the singular greatest honor of my life to be hosted on such a prestigious podcast. I'm always thrilled to help out LaSalle and also surprised that anyone cares or gives even a single hoot about what I have to say. But yes, I'm happy to be a part of the program.
Well, I will tell you this. It is your sermons that are some of the most enlightening, thought-provoking, and honestly funny. And I love the way you're able to incorporate all of that. So kind of before we get into, had you always been a very entertaining, funny type of person? Because I will tell you this, it makes just hearing what you have to say and just the dry sense of humor and the comedy woven into your message is just great.
Is there a question in there somewhere, or is it you just
no,
saying really nice things about me?
So had you always been a really engaging type of person, just really, really good with one-liners and comedy and whatnot? Because you really do work that in well.
I don't know that I would say I've always been so. I'm not 100% sure that I would completely agree with that assessment, but I do pride myself as being a man who loves a good story. Amongst my group, I think that many of my friends and the guys I grew up with and the people I've become close to over the years, I think of one of their charisms or value adds to our friendship and to our life is providing content. They do and say these outrageous things, and it becomes just another thing for me to remember, to try to draw some, lesson from and tell back in probably at least a slightly exaggerated form later on down the road. As to whether or not I've always, had a knack for it, I definitely haven't. I was a pretty awkward dude for a lot of my life and still am in some ways. But if you preach every day and if you really put a lot of work into it, and I think also for me, having a bilingual community and having to kind of think in multiple languages, it makes you comfortable. And then once you're comfortable, the truer version of you comes out. And I think people are drawn to authenticity. And so whether it's funny or not is for other people to decide, but I do try my best to tell a good story, weave some sort of message into it, and to be myself when I'm preaching, because I think that's what reaches hearts.
I think your messages resonate with our guys. And like I said, it's always been one of the most enjoyable masses that I have the honor to going to, and it's something that I will always remember. You make things relatable, and we're going to get more into how you put your messages together before you preach. But let's take a step back and go back in the way back machine here, not too far back, because you're still a young guy.
I am 36, but
oh my gosh,
but I look older than that, don't I?
You look fantastic, by the way.
Thank you. I'm very handsome.
You are very handsome. I would say this. You also, and I mean this in the nicest way, if you didn't smile at someone, I think somebody would walk the other way, because you're a very large statured man. I just wanted to say that. I thought, wow, this guy's a big dude.
Yeah, I don't know if I can, tell this story necessarily, or, what your language guidelines are, but I was in the gym the other day, and most of my workout clothes are from LaSalle. Nice. And so I can't really, hide my connections. But on this particular day, I happened to be wearing my Covington Latin gear where I went to high school. Nice. And there was a kid from LaSalle working out, and he was on the bench, and I walked past him, and I wondered, is he gonna recognize me? Is he gonna put two and two together? And as I walked past, he says, Are you Father McCullough? Are you the priest? And I said, yeah, that's me. And he looks at me for a second, and then he just says, You're big as hell, man. And I was like, thank you. That's going to get me through the next couple months. That compliment, like having somebody in the gym tell you, like, man, you're huge. I'm like, I will take that. I'm going to put that in my, in my back pocket. And whenever I need to feel better about myself, that's going to be what does it. So
It's interesting because, and maybe this doesn't sound right, you don't fit the mold. I guess when I think of a priest, I think of somebody who is smaller, maybe a little bit more frail. You know what I mean? Just smaller in nature. And you got like a Hulk Hogan type of guy here, and I'm like, wow, this is totally different. But again, you don't know who is going to come into the spiritual world, and when their calling is going to happen at different points. And I guess let's kind of jump right into there. How did you know, or maybe when did it start to enter your mind that, you know what, this is something that I would really like to do? Was it over time? Was it a moment of clarity that hit you like a lightning bolt? Or kind of walk me through that process.
I think for me, it was more of a gradual realization of something that other people would have guessed earlier than I did, in the sense that, like, my mom always says that she suspected or even knew that I would be a priest from the time I was like in the second grade. And that's not uncommon, where, family members just have an intuitive sense of who someone is. And self-knowledge is hard. It's easier to look at someone else and say, I can tell what they would be good at, or I can see what kind of calling they might have. But for me, I grew up and wanted to do all the normal things. I grew up in a very, a faithful but pretty normal Catholic family, and a big part of that experience was going to mass with my family on Sundays and going to Catholic school, and my dad teaching us to pray. And he was a big devotee of the rosary, and so we would walk up to the grotto underneath St. Clement and pray the rosary together, mostly me and my dad and my brother. And I don't know, it was just kind of woven into the fabric of our lives. And I didn't think too much about being a priest, although I did have teachers, high school teachers, grade school teachers, who would ask, like, hey, have you ever thought about being a priest? Because again, people can tell, like, if you have the capacity for it before you're willing to admit it to yourself. And I would effectively, make the same bargain that everybody has, since the permanent diaconate became a thing again in like the 1970s, where I would say, well, no, but maybe after I do all the other things I want to do in my life, get married and have a bunch of kids, maybe I'll become a deacon, as though that's some sort of like bargain with God. Like, I'm not going to go the whole way or discern what my vocation really is, but maybe I'll give God that part of my life, because it seems like less of a commitment, which of course is ridiculous. But faith was a very important part of my life. And I, as a teacher, I taught for 2 years in between college and seminary. The biggest thing that moved me into the direction of having to answer that question for myself was that I had a student who was a junior in high school when I started teaching him, who was applying to college seminary. And for me, it was a really humbling moment, where it's like, this kid is like 16 or 17 years old, and he's filling out paperwork to give this a shot, because he's being incredibly generous with his relationship with the Lord. He has a sense that maybe this is what God wants him to do. And if that's the case, then he's going to step in and do it. And I thought, I'm supposed to be his spiritual guide and a mentor to him, and I'm his teacher. And I've been running from that question for some time now. And so I really just started praying about it more often. And when I was teaching and working a second job, delivering prescriptions for a pharmacy, I would pray the rosary. I would ask God to show me what I was supposed to do with my life. And eventually I just got to the point where I almost couldn't go a single day without thinking about what it might be like to be a priest, which is a pretty good sign that you should at least give it a shot. And that kind of led me down the path to applying and just saying, you know what, I'm 22 years old. And when I get out of my first year of seminary, I'd be 23. And maybe I check the box and say, okay, I gave it a year and that wasn't for me. And maybe I continue on and do it. But 23 isn't exactly the time to be picking out caskets, So I was willing to give it a year and see if that's where the Lord wanted me to be. And over the course of that year, it became very apparent that it was. And so I'm very grateful just to all the people who supported me in that, and the people who spurred that question in my mind and got me to the point where I got past a lot of the fear and embraced what really is a very beautiful life.
When you say, people had noticed early on that this was something that might be a calling for you, was it just your level of maturity? Was it just, and it might be a multitude of things, the way you carried yourself, just, how passionate you were about your faith? Did they ever looking back now ever say, you'd be really good for this because I think X, Y, and Z, like you would be a great advisor to people, or you have a great compassionate side? I'm sure there's a lot of intangibles that they were probably thinking about that as well. But did anybody ever come back after the fact and say, you know what, this is really what I thought you would end up doing, and here's why?
Well, I'll tell you right now, he's such a compassionate guy was not really a factor in anybody's. I'm glad that you think that about me, and I'm sure there's other people who will say, yes, Father McCullough, very compassionate. I walk around with just like it's not nearly as bad as it was before I really threw myself wholeheartedly into like the sacramental life. But oh man, I just have there is a fire, and there's just a burning rage that's always, just waiting to go off. I don't like tee off on staff members or anything like that, but it's just the dumbest things. If anybody could hear the way that I talk to myself and to others when I'm driving alone in my car, they would say, okay, compassion was not the thing that drew McCullough to the priesthood. But I think from a very early age, there was a streak for piety, just like one of the gifts of the Spirit. I had a tremendous witness from my dad of what it meant to be a man of prayer. And I think that made a big difference. When people see someone who takes that time to pray and who, thinks to pray in tense moments. I remember at a basketball practice when we were in like the third or fourth grade, my best friend, dislocated his shoulder, which nowadays I'd say rub some dirt in it and pop it back in. But when you're a kid, it's a big deal. It was scary. And, I stepped off to the side and was just like praying for him as, they were trying to figure out, do we call the paramedics? Do we, slam his shoulder back in? Like, what do you do? And that's not necessarily the most normal thing for like a third or fourth grader to do. So I think at an early age, just the foundation of piety and turning to prayer that came mostly from my dad was a big part of it. But I would say that later on in life, when I got into like high school and college, it leaned more towards just being incredibly passionate about seeking the truth, finding the truth, and defending the truth. I had a lot of experiences in my younger years where, not everything has to be a fight. Not everything has to be combative. Everything should be a competition in my mind. But, not everything has to be so combative, but there were just a lot of times where there were really what I felt like were earnest disagreements about important matters of the faith with people who I felt like should be doing a better job proclaiming the gospel, like standing up for what's right, or saying, here's I'm going to present what the church teaches. And just all the time I was engaged in these like pretty intense back and forths. And so my friends who knew me like from high school, when I went off to, a very Catholic college, and when I started teaching at a Catholic school, and then when I went into seminary, it was surprise level 0, because there was just like, from an early age, the people who knew me when I was a kid would say, yep, that's a man who likes to pray. And the people who knew me when I was a little bit older would say, yep, that's a guy who is super passionate about the truth of the faith. I am not surprised that that's what God called him to. I think that's a pretty positive framing of my vocation. There's a lot of my own brokenness in there that we can just gloss over, but I would say those would be the major things that people would say made it the least surprising thing ever when I went to seminary.
So you're at basketball practice, dislocated shoulder, you kneel down by your teammate and you pray for them. During, let's say, high school, obviously you're having these thoughts, what can I do? And you're very passionate about it. You're having these great discussions with people. And it really sounds like you really wanted to hold people to a higher standard. People, if they really were believing what they were saying, you wanted to be, well, then walk this walk a little bit more. Would that be kind of accurate with what your thoughts were just about the fervent reasoning for you wanting to get into these debates was, you can do better than what I'm seeing right now?
I think back then it probably that is certainly a major it's a motivating factor for me now, in the sense that I want myself and my staff and the people that I work with, in the mission of bringing people to Christ. I want them to have their lives be entirely in accord with their stated beliefs and with their identity as Catholic disciples of Christ. I think back then it would have had a lot more to do with just inconsistencies between what we teach and what we proclaim and what people would say instead. It wasn't like, it was easier for me back then to say like, okay, well, this person claims to care for the poor or love the marginalized or do these other things, but like they don't seem to be walking that walk so much. I don't think that that was as much of a concern for me, because like that's something that we should all be working on, and we should be encouraging each other in that. And that should be something that we, as iron sharpens iron, we lead each other deeper into a life of service. But it would just, I don't know, it bothered me, I think in large part because a big moment of conversion for me, like a moment when the faith became real and not just like a set of rules or a philosophy, was I was reading a book on apologetics, and I was stalling. There was a paper I was supposed to be working on that I didn't want to do. And so I was reading one of my dad's books about like, here's how you explain and defend the faith. And as I read it, and I'm just flipping through and glancing at different chapters, I thought in my conscious mind, wow, it's kind of crazy how there's like an explanation for all these different objections. And then in my unconscious mind, call it the Holy Spirit or who knows what, says it's because it's the truth. And that was such a foundational moment for me, because it's like, we're not trying to come up with explanations or excuses for the way things are or the way that we do things. We're trying to identify on the deepest level possible the true. And if we really believe what Christ says, that the truth will set us free, then we should be embracing the truth as a means to find freedom, not only for ourselves, but for others.
Kind of taking a side path here as we tell your story. Why do you think so many people struggle with faith, in your opinion?
I imagine, many people listening to this are familiar with the phrase, the old saying about how good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times, and hard times create strong men, and strong men create good times. And there's kind of a cyclical generational thing where you really can, like, not every baby boomer is the same, and not every member of Gen X is the same, or every millennial is the same. Like, it would be painting in far too broad strokes to say that, but you can identify trends in different generations, I think, for a reason, because we see what came before us, we react to it and create, something of a new, not a new reality, but certainly like a new dynamic or a new understanding or a new cultural expression of, what it means to be a society, or what it means to be the Catholic Church, or any of these things. And then the following generation sees that, and maybe sees its strengths and its weaknesses, but particularly its deficiencies, and goes off in a slightly different direction. And then the generation after that does the same thing, and the cycle continues. And I think that right now we're seeing, not in my generation, but in the generation and a half that comes after us, a real sense of people searching for something that is concrete, because we've come out of a time that's been a lot more fluid and a lot more detached from the idea of there being a standard, not just that we're called to live by because it's the rules, but a standard that we're called to live by because it's in accord with our nature, because there's something outside of us that says, this is what it means to be human, and this is what is ultimately going to be fulfilling for humans. And so I think that we find ourselves in a situation where there's a tremendous opportunity to proclaim the gospel, because people are looking for that surety. They're looking for solid ground. They're looking for something to stand on. And man, when they find it, either in like micro situations or in macro situations, it really is beautiful. It's literally like why I do the job that I do, because we're here for conversion. We're here for transformative union with Christ. Somebody comes into contact with Jesus Christ and their life changes because of it. It looks different before and after they experience who Jesus Christ is.
You'd mentioned earlier on how you started to have the idea that this was your calling, and then you were praying upon it when you had your free time, and then you finally decided that you were going to go ahead and fill out that paperwork. And what is that process like?
Well, I've been trying to get them to update the process and make it into more of like a Thunderdome style thing where, two men enter, one man leaves kind of scenario. But I'll take a moment just to shout out my friend and guy I was in seminary with, Father Mike Willig, who just became the vocations director for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. He's a West Side boy, went to Mount St. Joe, just a solid all around dude. And, he's a fair bit shorter than me, but he was a wrestler in college. And so if you were going to make a list of priests that I'd be afraid I couldn't beat in a fight, he'd be up there. So If anybody is thinking about a vocation to the priesthood, if any of the young guys at LaSalle or the recent grads are looking to start that process or to see what it might be like firsthand, not just from me, call up Father Mike Willig and get connected to him. But I'd say it's similar to a college application process and a little bit more in depth in some important areas. So they're going to look at transcripts of like whatever your highest achieved level of education is. There are college seminaries and then there's major seminaries. So if a young man wants to go into the seminary from the Archdiocese, we don't have a college seminary here in the Archdiocese. So we have relationships with Bishop Simon Brute in Indianapolis and the Pontifical College Josephinum in Columbus. And there's application processes for those institutions that, it's almost like there's an umbrella thing where it's like, here's the letter of recommendation, the application, the essay, the psychological evaluations and everything. And then there's also like a school element to it. So they will look at, does this man have a baseline academic aptitude to be able to fulfill all the requirements and learn the things that he needs to learn. It's not primarily an academic vocation, but you do have to take a lot of classes. And then there's, at least when I applied, which is going all the way back to like 2011 now, I had to write a 10 to 12 page biography, like autobiography of my life, which at that point, I didn't feel like there was 12 pages worth of anything to say. But again, I love a good story. So if you exaggerate it, you fill in some details that may or may not have happened, maybe it gives you the extra page or two that you need. I needed something like 10 or 12 recommendations, one of which has to be from your pastor. So I know that I asked the pastor of my home parish and then the longtime pastor of my home parish, who had since stepped down into being the vicar there. They both wrote them for me. I was 2 years out of college, so I asked some college professors, like my thesis director from my undergrad years, to write letters for me. The chaplain at Christendom College where I went, and my employer, a handful of just other folks that I thought would be good references, and then eventually they bring you in and you do like a full day of psychological evaluations and testing to try to see if there's maybe there's some severe psychological things that need to be addressed outside of the seminary context, and like, hey, this is somebody who has some things that really need to be worked over and healed before he would be considered an applicant for seminary. And there might even be some red flags that would get thrown up that would say, I'm not sure I would, admit this guy under any circumstances, just based, you'd have to tank it pretty bad, but that's what the evaluation's there for, as well as to say, like, maybe there's things that come up in the evaluation that says this man has tremendous, possibility, potential to become a priest. And while he's in formation, there should be extra care allotted to make sure that he is learning these things or healing from these things, or maybe unpacking some of the struggles and difficulties that he carries with him, because we are recruiting men from the world and from the culture. And you're not pulling guys out of a cabbage patch somewhere. They come with their strengths as well as their weaknesses. And that's really, I'm a very different man than I was when I went into seminary. It's called formation for a reason. It changes you as you go through it for the better.
I don't know if a lot of people realize that, just the process of what it takes. And that's fascinating to know that, in addition to academics, like you said before, you have to have an aptitude. There's a lot of classes that you have to go through, and the abilities to be able to reach people and communicate, but also what has happened to you in your life and to psychologically delve into that. And I think that's tremendous, because to me, it sounds like even before they admit someone, they want what's best for them. And what's best for them ultimately is going to be what's best for a church and to be a spiritual leader for people. So it's like, let's make this person whole, if there are some areas that need some work, so we can make them the best version of themselves.
Yeah, I think something that people don't really think about, leaving seminary or being asked to leave seminary or discerning out of seminary, is a failure in some way. But if it's done for the right reasons, if you go into seminary and then you realize I need to take time away to heal, or God isn't calling me to this, it's the same thing as like if you go into, premarital counseling and you're working with the priest and you guys are praying together as a couple and getting ready for marriage, and you realize you need extra time, then it probably looks like a failure or something of a shock or a scandal in the outside world. Like, oh, they pushed their wedding back, or they decided to break off the engagement and they're going to work through some things. But in the end, if you make that decision for the right reasons and because you want to be able to enter more fully into the vocation itself, then it's a win. It doesn't matter what the world says about it. Like, if you personally are responding in generosity to the call that God has put in your life, then that counts as a huge success in the real scorebook.
Let's kind of fast forward to, you know, being done with seminary and wanting to put people ahead of them and wanting to see the best to come out of someone. And that's a very giving and also very difficult at times. I mean, if we're going to be honest, did you realize how emotionally, mentally taxing it can be? Did they talk about that? You know, hey, before you guys, finish with seminary, just understand what those tolls are and all of that you carry with you, even when you go home at night.
Yeah, I mean, the night before we were ordained, they were like, "Oh, hey, and by the way, this life is really hard sometimes. So good luck out there." um, I would say that I was roughly as prepared for it as most couples are for marriage when they get married, which is to say, not really at all.
Yeah.
Um, and that's not because of a lack of formation or foresight on the part of the seminary, because I really think that we have a great seminary here in town and they did everything they could to pass on the things that we need to know. But ultimately, there are elements of one's vocation that you really only learn by being thrown into it. And the tremendously encouraging thing about that is that there are also graces that go along with any vocation that support us and in many ways buoy us during that time where we're finding our way. In the same sense that there's like a honeymoon stage for couples when they first get married, where maybe they're idiots and maybe they're really naive about the level of sacrifice and communication and death to self and all those other things that are necessary that they're going to figure out over the next 30 or 50 years or whatever. Their love for each other gets them through. And I think sometimes about the things that I said yes to in my first year as a priest and the way that I just threw myself whole. Like, I didn't really take a day off, and I was everywhere. I was everywhere doing all kinds of things and could not have been happier. I was like a pig in mud. And nowadays I've just recognized, like, you know what, that was not a sustainable pace of life. And when I tried to translate that to being a pastor of 3 parishes, that as well. And so I've had to kind of walk back, like, all right, what is an appropriate, I still want to be generous and completely give myself to this vocation, but I can't do that if I'm dead. So, what does it look like for me to prioritize going on retreat and having a day off and maintaining strong relationships with my priest friends and with the friends that I grew up with, and doing what's necessary for me to be able to pour myself out into the vocation, so I'm not just running around dealing with fires, always on the defensive and killing myself, because I don't think that's really a full or beautiful representation of what our vocations are supposed to be. They should be generous, they should be self-giving, but it doesn't diminish who you are. It makes you more fully yourself.
You just touched upon something that I want to kind of jump into here. Anybody you went through seminary with that you look back on and you have a strong relationship with, man, this is a friendship for life, and I'm so glad our paths crossed.
Yeah, there certainly are. And I only say it because I have confidence that, none of the guys I went to seminary with are going to be listening to a Salle podcast. So I'd hate for them to know how much they mean to me. I was tremendously lucky. I felt like in high school and in college and in seminary, I just happened to walk into the perfect class for me. I had a wonderful group of friends in high school, and I had a wonderful group of friends, the classmates I graduated from college with. And then when I got to seminary, it's a much smaller group. So you think, what are the odds that I'm going to have those tight-knit friends? But in seminary, we were oftentimes poked fun of as a class because we'd meet in my room we called it coffee and conversation, probably 2, 3, 4 times a week. My door was always open. It was just kind of the natural hangout spot. And we spent a lot of time together. We hung out a lot. And as we've continued on and begun our ministry, we have guys spread all over the place. One of my classmates that I talk to, I'd say at least once a week, is all the way up in Wapakoneta. And so he is border patrol. His borders are right up against the Diocese of Toledo. So we make sure that he holds those rat finks back from invading our glorious archdiocese. But I have numerous guys in my class that I talk to regularly, and we have a group chat where we kind of share stuff. And a lot of times it's just keeping up on what's going on and talking about the interesting or funny things happening in our life. But I also know that I can call any of those guys and say, hey man, I'm really having a low moment. I'm just like, I just need to call and verbalize all of this because I don't want to go back over to my rectory and be left alone. And a lot of ways that a life of celibacy, if lived in isolation, can lead into just unchecked vice and spiritual desolation because there's no one there to share life with or to hold you accountable. And I've gone out of my way to make sure that, since I became a pastor, about a year and a half after I started as a pastor, I had some guys, from neighboring parishes and assignments move in with me. And ever since then, I've had, a vicar or multiple vicars or guys from other assignments who want to live in community living together because, doing this by yourself and being isolated is a tremendously bad idea. And I've seen it ruin guys. But we're pretty good about sticking together and lifting each other up in those bleak moments. And that's an important part of the life.
Had you ever had what it would like to be a dad? Does that stuff, crawl into your mind at any point in time? Like, the relationship you had with your dad and how special that was?
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, I really firmly believe that if a man doesn't have the strength and the graces necessary to be a good husband and a father, then he has no business being a priest. This life is somehow easier or harder than the life of a dad. It's ultimately a reflection of God's fatherhood. Both natural fatherhood and supernatural fatherhood are a reflection of our Father in heaven who sent his Son into the world in the Holy Spirit to redeem those under the law. And so if you don't learn to embrace your cross as a priest, and you don't learn to embrace your cross as a dad, then you're failing at whichever vocation you've received. And that's a tragedy. The only real tragedy is to not become a saint. And I don't know, in sort of like a fictional idealized version, I've mentioned to parishioners before that, my life, if I hadn't been called to the priesthood, is one of a family and almost complete anonymity outside of that family. I would love to be, I would own a baseball glove repair shop, and I would fix baseball gloves that people mail to me in a back room in my house while I smoke a pipe. And then I mail them back to them, and we never see each other. And I have 6 or 7 daughters, and, I marry a pretty Irish girl, and I have 6 or 7 daughters. They all play stringed instruments and do Irish dance. And I shine their shoes on Saturday nights so that we go to mass on Sundays. And maybe sometimes I lector or I'm the sacristan or something. But other than that, just like there's something public about being a priest that's like, yeah, this isn't really what I would have picked for myself. But on a much more, I don't know, real level, like not that made up version of my life that I look off into the distance and think, oh, what could have been. I tell people sometimes in more honest moments that if I were to have been married and had kids, and like when I was in college, there was a young lady that I dated, I think, pretty seriously, and certainly would have married her if she had stuck around long enough. And, ultimately discernment led us in different directions. And we still keep in touch a little bit. I'll, call her every now and again, and she lives out of town and wonderful person, but recognized that there was something in me in my life that was like, yeah, I don't think he really knows what this is, like what's going on. And I think that if I were to have been married successfully and happily, and who knows, because God's grace is such that he could take somebody who's just super broken and ignorant and naive about what a certain life requires of you and fix it. But I think that if it were to happen on like a practical level, I probably would have had to go to seminary for like a year or two to see the things that really needed healing, and then discerned out and then also gotten married probably before I was like 28 or 29, because by that point I'm very stubborn. And it's hard for me to imagine past that point in my life just saying like, yeah, I'll share a bathroom with someone for the rest of our days. Like something about that just seems like, wow, celibacy maybe isn't as hard as everybody makes it out to be, because if I'm in bed at night and I decide that I want the window open, that is the beginning and end of that conversation.
This is
Like
true.
so yeah, I really think that there are so many amazing elements of fatherhood and of being a husband that like I'm edified by when I see them in my friends and in my parishioners and in the men who are really intentional about the way that they love their wives and their children, that seem really beautiful to me. And I think that I would have I would have needed a very interesting and particular path to get there and to be successful at it, because I see secondhand, I suppose, from being in the confessional and being in conversations with people in my office, like what a lot of the challenges are and the strength that's needed to get through that. And I think also it's important to note that I very much see my vocation as a priest and a pastor as being dovetailed with the great families who are in these parishes, that I learn from them and they learn from me, and together we form our particular church's version of the body of Christ. Like we play our little part, and priests and families lift one another up in really beautiful and interesting ways. So yeah, it seems pretty awesome, and it seems also pretty difficult, and I have a lot of confidence that God put me where I'm supposed to be.
What is it like when you're quote unquote home? And, is it easy to turn it off? Is it easy just to be Alex? I mean, because so many people look at you. I mean, a lot of people. And do you ever feel like, hey, I'm Alex right now? I mean, Father, I need to talk to you. And it's, you know what I mean? It's like, is there a way that people can just let your hair down, if you will? Or do you feel like, even when I'm Alex and I'm just talking to people and I'm having a regular conversation, I'm having a drink with some people, talking about the Reds or whatever it may be, that somehow it always kind of follows it way back in there? Or do you feel like there's certain people who understand we still need to recognize you as a person outside of that as well? Or are those lines very blurred?
Hmm. Well, first of all, I'll just say that there's maybe 5 people in the world who call me Alex, because I feel like it's Father Alex or Father McCullough to just the vast majority of people. And then I have so many of my closest friends, like is the case in so many, especially men's lives, just call me these ridiculous, unhinged nicknames. Like a lot of the guys I went to seminary with called me Max, which is not any of my names. It's not my name. It's a mistake by a seminary professor who called me Max for about 2 months.
And then it
Short,
stuck.
short name, ends with X. My mom calls me George. Again, neither of my names. It goes back to me and my brother both having names that start with A. And so she just randomly assigned us George and Fred when we were kids. So uh, there's very few people who literally call me Alex, but I would say that I have I have a tremendous blessing in my life, in the sense that I have the other priests, and this year the seminarian intern that I live with, who understand the life to some degree. And so like when I come home to the place where we communally live, everyone knows the struggle and everyone knows like what are the difficulties of the life. And I have my friends that I grew up with who come over for a poker night about once a month. They call me Foobs. That's another one entirely. There's the nicknames abound. Um, and for them, they know what I do and they know the challenges and struggles of it, but it's pretty much just like hanging out with the same guys that I've known since, it's my brother and cousins and guys that I've known since the second grade, so, and I also have some, very deep friendships with people who work in kind of the ministerial world, where they know what it is to have your own challenges within your vocation, but then also to have people who rely on you in all kinds of hours and times and situations. But does it mean, I don't think that a father's identity is compromised by the fact that he has to get up in the middle of the night to change a diaper or to take care of his children or to protect his home or whatever it might be. And in the same sense, I don't think that my identity is lessened, but rather is only confirmed and strengthened by the fact that, yeah, I have friends and I know people who knew me well before I ever went into seminary, but also sometimes I get called out of bed at 2 a.m. because somebody's dying and they need a priest. And in the same sense that a man's always wearing his wedding ring, I am always ready to occasionally jump out of bed in the middle of the night and throw on a cassock over my pajamas and say, time to make the donuts and get on the road and go God knows where to bring someone Jesus in their final hours. So yeah, it's a challenge and it's beautiful. And I think that describes the Christian life almost in its entirety.
Let me ask you this. I've talked to police officers, detectives. There's a specific police department member that says he has been given the job of having to go tell parents when their kids have died. He said in the beginning it was very, very difficult, but he said, I need to keep my composure. I need to understand what I'm here to do. But I've had parents slam doors in my face or somebody want to smack me or just ball up and cry. And you've probably seen all of that. Any moments that you remember in particular that really made you say, I had a moment during this when I was here with this family that was something very unique and very special, almost, as that the presence of the Lord was with you. Anything like that that you'd like to share with us?
Man. Yeah. I mean, I guess that wasn't the question I was expecting. I thought you were going to say, like, will you tell us about your horrifying and difficult experiences, of caring for families in their worst moments? Because there's a lot of those. And God is, I would say that the way you deal with them initially is with shock. And then eventually you kind of find your way through it. And they're each unique and they are each a struggle and beautiful in their own way. But in terms of singular moments, there are many, but one of them that always jumps out to me that I mention sometimes in homilies is there was a time where I was brand new. I might not have been a priest for a year yet at this point. And I was in my room in the rectory, but all the phone systems were connected. And my phone rings and I picked it up. It was like my day off or something. And it was somebody from the parish who said, Father, this is really weird, but I had a son when I was in high school and I gave him up for adoption and I've never met him. And they just unsealed the documents and he reached out and wants to meet me and my family. And at this point, this woman was married and she had other children and not almost no one in the family kind of knew about the whole situation. And so it was a lot for everyone to process. And she said, he's going to come over in, 3 days. And so we were thinking in 2 days, we were just going to have like a big family event. We would have dinner. We would talk about it. We would process it. And it's probably going to be a late night. And we just kind of want to be together as a family. And then we'll have this plan for like how we're going to try to integrate this, this member of the family into our lives together. And would you be there with us? And she just said, like, it would be nice if there was someone to pray with us and you give your perspective or whatever. And if you're free, we'd love to have you. And I said, I will absolutely be there. And we, exchanged time, date and everything. And I said goodbye. And I hung up the phone and just like stared out the window for like 30 seconds and was basically like, I effing love being a priest. Like, this is what a badass moment to get invited into, that this family is having this huge catharsis and this like rediscovery of this chapter of life. And they said, you know what, we want our priest to be there with us. And it was so beautiful. And it was heavy. It was heavy stuff, but it was such an honor and such a graced moment and really kind of a reminder of, what the whole point of, celibacy for the kingdom is. It's like, you don't belong to yourself and you don't belong to one family. And in that moment, I was like, I was there to be completely and radically, totally available to this family that needed and wanted a priest in the presence of the church. It was awesome.
I can't compare this to anything like that, but meeting a student in the hallway or meeting them at a sporting event and they say, let's sit down and talk. And you get to know them on a deeper level. And they start saying things back to you that you had said in class. Might be in a smaller sense, kind of comparable to that because it comes back to you. We often talk about in life, you plant these seeds and you never normally see the fruits of your labor, right? Time goes by, they go on, they do their thing. But when that does come back to you, much like it's amazing. And no matter what it is, and I had it this past Friday night at the football game, and it was a student came up to me and just kind of leaned on the fence and said, I thought about what you said when I was in your class. And I'm thinking, what? The person you wouldn't even expect, but you're there, they're there, they made a connection. And again, I swear that's everything happens for a reason.
And it's having worked in education and as a priest, that one of the things that I preferred about working for a pharmacy where I would, spread blacktop and lay down mulch and patch concrete was you get to see what you do, when you work with like the physical world. But you really have to hang your hat on those handful of moments as a priest or as a teacher where you see evidence of what you've done. It's a beautiful thing and it's so much more rewarding, but it's definitely not, you can't go home and say, I did X number of square yards worth of mulch today. Like it's a little less measurable sometimes, but those moments when they come really are life changing.
Would you say in our closing moments here, would you say that a lot of times, when people pray or they're wanting to connect with God, and in my wife, God, I love her because she grabs me by the collar and says, "Shut up and just slow down." And because sometimes I go at a feverish pace, she says, "God's always talking to you. The problem is you're not willing to listen, or you're not willing to listen to what his answer is." And you know what? That is so the truth. And it's funny because it's not until those conversations happen and someone slaps you and says, "Doggone it, just stop." And when I started to do that, and that's when I started to realize, I started to see things that the Lord does in ways that they're not all going to be these monumental things, right? They're going to be moments and they may be subtle, but damn, it does something to you. And it makes everything worth it. And you see it more than anybody. These moments happen. And until you stop and slow down and go, you know what? Hey, I appreciate that. I needed that. I needed that. And it's just like, gosh.
One of the things that I tell guys all the time, and this I think it's especially important for young men to hear. So like the guys at LaSalle, but for anyone to hear really is that you can't wait until there's a moment of great need or of great want to reach out to God and connect with Him in a moment of prayer. He will obviously be present to people in those moments if they wait until then. But if you establish a rule of life that puts you in that path of probability. I have a good friend who talks about this all the time, that you put yourself in the path of probability. If I want to know what God is saying to me, if I want to understand his call in my life and where he's active in my life and how I should respond, then I have to put myself in a situation to hear that and understand that. And so you make a rule of life that says, I'm going to make some conscious decisions and discern what I should be doing, how often I should be doing it, what does my prayer life look like, and stick to that so that we have the habit and the pattern and the capacity to receive from the one who wants to give us more than we would ever dare to ask for.
Guys, we've been talking with Father McCullough here and just getting some real great insight into life and what it is to be a man of faith. And for all of you guys listening to this, I cannot stress enough that your life is going to be so much richer, but God's always going to be there. He's your one rock person that's always going to be there. And you got to foster that relationship, right? I mean, just like with anything, you got to put the work and the time in, and it's a relationship you got to work at. And Father McCullough has definitely lent his expertise and his insight to that as well. So I cannot thank you enough for allocating a portion of your evening to talk to myself and our listeners as well, and in telling your story. My final question would be, what's your message to people who see the world, and right now they see a lot of craziness happening, right? And there's a lot of unrest, and it just seems like there's so much troublesome things going on, and people are questioning what where their faith really lies, what would you say to them if they say, man, I just don't know where to go?
I would tell them that the most important thing to remember is that God is not nervous about any of this. We live in an age of great anxiety, and I think in some ways we're addicted to it. That first taste of peace that we get, where the noise settles down. Like if you were to go into a monastery or a convent, like I do for retreat every year, and turn off your phone, for most people, the first thing that would happen, like as soon as that peace descended upon them, is they would start itching for, like, I need to be bothered. Like we're looking for something to upset us. And so we run from the peace that God wants us to have. But God isn't worried about any of these things. And if we prioritize him and put him at the center of our life, which doesn't mean ignoring everything else. It just means you plant that flag and you say, it doesn't mean my marriage is less important or my job is less important or any of the other things are less important. It just means that God is at the center and all of their importance is contingent upon my relationship with God. Because ultimately, when we recognize that he made us so that he could love us and so that we would love him in return, everything else gets put through those filters and it just seems so much less troubling to live in a world. Even when you see pain and sin and death and all of the other things that we know can rob us of our peace, if we stay rooted on that rock and we live out of that reality that we were made to be sons and daughters of the Most High, then everything else clicks into place. And it's a beautiful thing when you see it happen.
I love it. Father, thank you so much for taking time to join us this evening. And is there any chance that I could twist your arm? I mean, I physically could not. I mean, with a cutoff shirt, walking in the gym with the guns hanging and banging, what I'm probably going to say is, excuse me, Father, is there any chance you would join us again sometime and just kind of help continue that journey to help some people understand the importance and the relationship of the Lord?
Yeah, absolutely. And I try to give as much of my time and energy to LaSalle as I can. That seems, appropriate given all my other responsibilities, but
Sure.
it's been a spiritual home for me, and I'm happy to help out however I can. And, they can find me on the sidelines of football games. They can find me at a lot of the all school masses and things. And I'm sure if you guys ever get so starved for content that you think you want to listen to me drone on again, I will find a way.
Father, we will talk to you down the road, my friend. Thank you so much again for tonight.
Absolutely. God bless you guys. Thanks for everything.
All right, you've heard it from the man himself, Father Alex McCullough. Guys, this has been such a fun episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please continue to follow all forms of LaSalle social media, and you'll be aware of the next time another episode drops. For everybody here at WLSN, my name is Mike Freland, and I will catch you on the next episode of the Five Pillar Podcast.